introduce my friend Jessica Pettitt, who I said earlier is a diversity and social justice speaker, and she's actually traveling now. She travels the country, seems to be in a different state every day. And so she's in Utah this morning. She woke up early to start this conference with us, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my friend Jess.
Hi, and thank you very much for joining in, and thank you, Jeff and Break Drink. I think it's really important to provide professional development, specifically when all of our budgets are getting cut. So thank you, Break Drink, for that service. Today we're going to talk about trans inclusion, and I'm going to try my best to do this within a kind of broad stroke of different factors within student affairs. Obviously, time is limited, so I'm going to go pretty fast, but one of the first things that I want to do is I want to start with some language, because oftentimes I think we have different access to different words, and sometimes they're confusing. We tend to kind of pair things up in our heads as binaries or, salt and pepper, this and that. So for those of you that have access to the two-sided handout, the first side is got an umbrella on it with some definitions, and the back side is a blank triangle. The blank triangle we're going to be using momentarily, so if you haven't downloaded the handout, you might at least want to get a doodle pad and a pen or download the handout. What I want to do first is I want to talk about language. So oftentimes the word trans is used as an umbrella term, and transgender and transsexual can also be used as umbrella terms. So sometimes that can be confusing because people want to know kind of the difference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of boil down these two words as they are typically put together in a binary, so you can understand typically how the uses are utilized to describe a community. So first off, I use the word trans as the ultimate umbrella term of everything non-gender normative. Transgender and transsexual are both individual identities as well as umbrella terms. Let's start with transsexual. So transsexual typically renders up a group of community members who are interested or have access to hormone therapy or surgeries to physically alter their bodies. Transgender began to be developed and used because not everyone is interested in hormone therapy or surgeries, and not everyone has financial access to hormone therapies or surgeries because nothing is covered by, or at least it's very, very rarely covered by insurance. And some people don't like doctors whether they're trans or not. So transgender began to be used to be slightly more of an umbrella term for people who want hormones and surgeries as well as those who don't. There's lots and lots and lots of conversations and debate about all of these definitions, but I think that's kind of an easy starting point of how to think of the two words differently. Next up, we have crossdresser and drag king or queen. Some people are a little bit more familiar with transvestite or drag queens. Transvestite is a pejorative word in the surveys done of the transvestite or cross-dressing communities, so that these are mostly heterosexual men. What is interesting about crossdresser in conjunction with a drag performer is that the crossdresser might wear the quote-unquote other gendered clothing in a very, very private manner. Their roommates or family or partners or house pets, etc., may not even know that they do this. It's very, 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 very private. And the reason that they do it could be emotional, psychological, spiritual, or sexual in nature, and it's a very, very private act. That's the key. When we're talking about drag kings and drag queens are biological women who are performing and wearing men's clothing. Drag queen is a biological man who's wearing women's clothing and performing as a woman. These are very, very public performances in quote-unquote the other types clothing. So I think that's a good example, too, of a binary that's often confused in our heads, the difference being private for crossdresser and public for drag king or drag queen. Then we have intersex condition and gender variant. Depending on your table package, depends on how much access you've had to these concepts. Within the intersex community, there's a debate of whether you say intersex, intersexed with an ED at the end, or if someone has an intersex condition. You might be more familiar with the term hermaphrodite. That word is now considered pretty pejorative, and what it basically means is that there is an incongruency, an external or internal body parts in relation to how one was labeled at birth. We're going to get more into that when we get to the triangle, but in general, that's what that means, is that it's a physical body part incongruency. There's about 1 in every 2,000 births within the United States where something external doesn't align with the measurements related to newborns. But usually any kind of internal incongruence isn't discovered unless there is a puberty, fertility, or menopausal issue. When we get to gender variant, what this basically means is that the person might be more comfortable with their bodies, but it's the actual binary gender system of male and female that they don't fit into. So this might be inclusive of androgynous, or someone who might dress more masculine one day and more feminine another day. Their gender variance or gender queerness is part of who they are. They're generally more comfortable with their bodies, but less comfortable with the gendered system. So that's kind of how those two get paired up together. Then we have a new term that's starting to be used is cisgendered. For a really long time when we talked about trans issues, I myself am a biological woman. I was born a girl. I was labeled female, and once I had a sense of self, I identified as a woman, and all of that seemed to work out just good. When we were talking about trans issues, for a really long time, the language we used was that I was a normal woman. I'm using air quotes that you can't see, and then trans women were something else. Well, obviously, that can feel really pejorative as well, and so the term cisgender has started to be used to really address the privilege of those of us that when we developed a sense of self, agreed and concurred with how we were labeled at birth. There's a privilege there that has gone unclaimed, and the responsibility related to that has gone unclaimed for a really long time because we just called it normal. So instead of being pejorative, cisgendered is those of us that agree or have a sense of congruency with how we were labeled at birth. All of these vocabulary words that we talk about, and there's many, many more that we could have talked about, but all of these words generally talk about sex, gender, and sexual identity, and then how they intersect with sexism and heterosexism. So for those of you that have the handout, I'd like you to flip it over to the blank triangle, and this particular model was developed to help understand sex, gender, and sexual identity. Now the reason why I want to start with this too is that when I'm working within student affairs, either doing an educational program, a consulting work, or consulting trip with a particular university, or even over my 10 years of working in student affairs on a number of different campuses, really when we start talking about non-discrimination policies and trans inclusion and bathrooms and programming and records and documents and identification and things like that, what I found was that it was really hard for people to find themselves in the model or in the conversation. And the truth is that we all have a sex, we all have a gender, and we all have a sexual identity. So when we go through this model, I'd like for you to spend some time filling it in, but also really paying attention to kind of where you fit in the particular model. Because once we know where we fit in, then it's a lot easier to have the conversations.
Jessica,
So,
there are several people that joined us since we got started, and just to let everyone know, you can find the link to that handout in the chat box. I posted it again, so if you just joined us and not sure what she's talking about, that's where you can find that.
Excellent. Sometimes my webinars are a little hard to jump into because you're like, what is she saying? So welcome. The handout is on the link in the checkbox. You can also go to my website at iamsocialjustice.com/webinars/files and be able to pull up some resources there as well. So for those of you that don't have access to the handout, grab some paper. Those of you that do, we're going to go through this model to kind of explain how sex, gender, and sexual identity are very separate from each other. So for the triangle, let's go to the top left corner and let's call that sex. So under sex, we're not talking about the act of. It's too early in the morning for that, and I am in Utah after all. We are going to talk about sex as in biology and anatomy. So when we talk about sex, what we're talking about are like genitalia, like penis and vagina, or chromosomes, X, Y, XX, hormones, estrogen versus testosterone. When we start talking about these things, in our heads, we have a very clear binary of who gets who. When we were talking earlier about intersex condition, it's when hormones, chromosomes, and genitalia may not perfectly align with each other. And like I said earlier, It's not always the case that we know internally if there's an incongruence unless there's a puberty, fertility, or menopausal issue. And then 1 in 2,000 births within the United States actually have an external genitalia incongruence that is usually surgically operated on at birth. And also it's fairly common that that's without parental consent. So usually the child doesn't know until, again, they start having some kind of puberty, fertility, menopausal, or sexual function issue. When we start talking about sex, in the box on the left side, what I also think is really important to mention are secondary sex characteristics. Oftentimes we look at hair, the level of voice, size, breasts, things like this, to really determine the sex of a person. But secondary sex characteristics are based on hormone levels in your body. And then we kind of look at them and we interpret them in a different way. So if we took facial hair, for example, some people have a lot of facial hair and they groom it and it's no shave November, or they have goatees or mustaches or Fu Manchus or full beards or ZZ Top style, and then they shave it all off. Where others, like myself, we have a grocery aisle to take care of it. So we either bleach it, tweeze it, electrolyze it, or wax it away. And some of us just rock it out, right? Like we got one persistent chin hair, and that's just what we do. Some people aren't as hairy as they wish they were. Some people are hairier than they wish they were. Or they have hair in the wrong place, whatever that means. That's all in relation to your hormone levels in your body. If we took breasts, for example, if you see someone who has fat deposited on their chest, which typically means that they have a higher level of estrogen, you might interpret them as breasts if you read that person to be a female. However, if you read that person to be a male and they have fat deposits on their chest, it goes from breasts to man boobs, which are significantly different in society, different connotations within society. So it's important to think about secondary sex characteristics in relation to sex, anatomy, and biology. If we move to the right side of the triangle, up at the top, I would label this gender. What's interesting about gender is that it's totally socially constructed. It's the interpretation of the man boobs versus the breasts, whereas sex would be fat stored on chest because of an estrogen level. When we talk about gender, everything kind of rolls up into roles, identity, perception, or expression. No matter what it is that you come up with, typically it fits into at least one of those categories, roles, identity, or expression. What's interesting about perception is that perception is the only one that you have no control over. So we use our roles, identity, and our expression of ourselves to send messages out to other people, hoping that they will perceive us the way we want to be perceived. But ultimately, we don't have any control over whether or not they do or don't do that. We do have control over the signals that we look for when trying to perceive other people. So I'm in airports a lot, so I play lots of fun games. When I look at people, I try to determine what variable is it that tips the scale for me that makes that person appear as a woman or as a man to me. If I can understand how I'm perceiving, then I can actually be able to understand what variables are important to me. So that's how gender works. It's socially constructed, which means that it changes over time. So if we were talking about George W. rolling up into a meeting in a powdered wig, Italian silk, French lace, velvet knickers, and heeled shoes, if I was talking about George Washington, that is how a white male U.S. president expressed masculinity and power. If I was talking about George W. Bush, that might have done something for his approval ratings, but it evolved over time. So now white male U.S. presidents express power that way. So gender is evolution. It's an evolving piece. At the bottom of the triangle is sexual identity. Some of you may be more accustomed to the word sexual orientation. I prefer the term sexual identity because a lot of these words are dependent on how one's gender is perceived, and that can change over time. So for sexual identity, this is where heterosexual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, there's new words constantly being developed to define one's relationship to another person. And I haven't checked Facebook today, so I don't know some of the new words. But I think that that's kind of what goes at the bottom. Now, what's interesting about the triangle, and so I'm going to give you like the cliff notes because I'm noticing more people are still joining us. But the cliff notes of the triangle are that sex is what I assume is in your pants. It's not socially acceptable to look at someone's make them drop their pants so that you can say thank you, sir or ma'am at Starbucks when you're picking up your latte. Generally not socially acceptable. Maybe make a note of that. But sex is what we assume is in your pants, whereas gender is how we interpret the pants themselves. What fabric are they made out of? How do they move in the world? How are they accessorized? What else are they standing with? What area are they with? It's the interpretation of the pants themselves. And then sexual identity is what I assume that person does with somebody else when their pants are off. Now, where the triangle can actually get really oppressive is that if I make an assumption of what you do when your pants are off, I'm also making an assumption of how the person you're doing that with, or persons, how they fit into the rest of the triangle. So because we like these binaries, if a woman presents in a really feminine way, it's going to be assumed that the person that she's having sex with when her pants are off would be more masculine. That, of course, isn't always the case, but that tends to be what people immediately assume. So not only do we make the assumption of the whole triangle about strangers at Starbucks, but we then apply it to the people we think they might be in relationship with. Specifically talking within student affairs, I think it's really important to understand this triangle, because if we can't understand ourselves within this particular model, then how are we supposed to come up with an inclusive residence hall policy or figure out about bathrooms or things like that? The last little piece before we move on are the arrows within the triangle. So across the top, what's keeping sex and gender in place is sexism. And we live in a sexist society where typically I think this is when men get blamed for everything. But going back to cisgendered privilege, what's important is that men and women both are supported in this cisgendered privilege manner, and that once they had a sense of self, they believe their identity is congruent with how they were labeled at birth. Those people typically have more privilege within a sexist society. And yes, men have more privilege than women because we live in a male-dominated sexist society. But both of these groups, and myself as a biological woman, I have to claim responsibility for the fact that I have more privilege than a trans person or a genderqueer person. So that's how sexism kind of locks sex and gender in place. From the top of the triangle to the bottom, what keeps sex and gender and sexual identity in place is heterosexism. It's by literally assuming that everyone is heterosexual unless otherwise told. This is also another form of oppression. So within that intersection, this is where straight men or women have the responsibility to claim and to be advocates for people who don't identify as straight or maybe don't identify as how they were labeled at birth. So this is why the intersection is so important. Then you can actually layer on multiple layers when we start talking about privilege. And we can talk about U.S. citizen, educated, upper class, Christian privilege, whiteness, able-bodied, etc. And that's where more and more layers of responsibility have been inherited based on these social constructed identities. So I'd like to take a pause there. We didn't say this at the beginning, but please, well, we mentioned the chat box. So if you have any questions or anything, please remember to text them off to the side on the chat box and or using Twitter. And Jeff will pull all of those questions together and be able to theme them, and I'll be able to answer your questions. So let's keep going. As we're waiting for questions to come in, I'll kind of keep talking, and then Jeff, just let me know whenever you're ready with questions. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Great. So I like to put this slide up there because I really do think that it's about responsibility. So this is a story about 4 people: everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. There was an important job to be done, and everybody was asked to do it. Everybody was sure somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. Somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought anybody could do it, but nobody realized that everybody wouldn't do it. It ended up that everybody blamed somebody when actually nobody asked anybody. I put this up here because I have been on a number of trans inclusion committees on campuses, and I feel like we get stuck in these kind of arguments all the time. Like, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to be inclusive? What is it that we're supposed to do next? So I created a document, and you can download the entire guide either from my website or it's the Facing Trans Resource Guide. If you shoot me an email, I'm more than happy to email it to you as well. It's Jess Jess at iamsocialjustice.com. But what I want to do is I want to spend the rest of the time really quickly going through, we're going to use healthcare as the first example. So one of these articles that we wrote is the suggested steps article, because we kept being asked for what are things that we're supposed to be able to do quickly, cheaply, et cetera, to be trans inclusive. So that's variable, of course, on every campus and budget. So we went through each different department and divided it into beginning, intermediate, and advanced. So I wanted to share some of those highlights from the beginning steps as we went through a college campus. So with healthcare, for example, if you're on a campus that has a health provider, ask students about what experiences they're actually having, and then identify, publicize, and affiliate with anybody that's actually supportive. Some of you may think, oh, well, there's nobody here that's supportive, but literally telling somebody that is actually more helpful than being ashamed of it. So finding out kind of what's available and making it available. When we look at residence halls, this is one of the most popular groups, is identifying and publicizing the names within residence halls who are actually knowledgeable, who are allies, or at least aware of some of these issues. Requiring all residence life staff to attend a training on trans issues, specifically regarding gender. If you're living in gendered housing or have gendered spaces, it's a good idea to have some education about that. Working on your housing policies to be inclusive of gender identity and expression, so that you understand how this is going to work when trans students need housing. Again, this is just a quick overview. Bathrooms is an area that I've actually spent a lot of specific time on because it seems to be one of the biggest question areas. One of the best things that you can do is actually just, especially if you have like a gung-ho group on campus, is have them do a survey of all of the bathrooms on campus and figure out how they are labeled, where the single occupancy bathrooms are, and making sure that those things are actually available through a website with a link in case people find others so that they can keep updating it. This is really, really helpful because if you have a single occupancy bathroom, it allows someone who doesn't want to go to bathroom with other people out of either fear of violence or not passing in that particular gendered space to be able to use the restroom. It's a free thing that you can do, and luckily, most of our campuses were built during segregation. That's kind of a sarcastic luckily. And so there are still structures on campus that were colored bathrooms at some point. So those often have been converted into single-use bathrooms or even custodial closets. But knowing where those spaces are could actually really help someone. It doesn't cost anything. Locker rooms are very similar. Finding out where or what is available for people to be able to change clothes. Bathrooms and locker rooms are a great time to also build some partnerships with faculty groups. Faculty don't usually like changing clothes in a locker room with students that might be by because of the power dynamics. You can also build some relationships and some allies relationships with disability services for students who have caretakers who are of another gender. Providing a single occupancy bathroom space is actually really helpful for them as well. Also families, for people who have children who are a little too old to be in the wrong, quote-unquote, wrong gendered bathroom and a little too young to go to the bathroom by themselves. They may also benefit from these spaces. Records and documents kind of is another really big snafu, and it's fascinating when I work with all the different databases and things like that on campus, is that it really is about providing a backspace possibility. Also figuring out how your state actually works with birth certificates. Sometimes people say that they're going to make decisions based on how someone registers for campus, but sometimes somebody's identity development, luckily for student affairs, is increasing while we're in college. So as one identity develops, there are other changes that come with that. Also, we know that there are a lot of parents who fill out admissions papers, etc., so that's not the most reliable source. So how can people create an easy access way to update names or gender markers and things like that within records and documents? If they can't, publicizing that they can't. I'm assuming that I'll be fielding some questions about birth certificates and things like this, and like Facebook says, it's really complicated. Some states will not update a birth certificate. Others will, but you have to have surgeries, which is expensive. Or you have to go to a therapist for a number of times and get a letter that states that you actually are transitioning. All of these kind of gatekeeping methods make it really difficult for records and documents outside of a university to be updated. And it's actually much easier within the institution to have them updated. So keeping going. We talk about public inclusion, to be mindful of where there are gendered spaces, fraternities and sororities, sports teams, student organizations, and find out if there is a need for some of these gender-specific organizations to be trans-inclusive, beginning that conversation or recognizing that that conversation hasn't been started. Looking at forms for admissions or residence life, student health, human resources, and other college units to allow for trans self-identification. This is also important. I actually got a flu shot at Walgreens, and it asked me to fill out a form, and it said gender, male and female. And technically speaking, male and female are sex demarkers. Gender would be masculine or feminine or man or woman, but if I identified as trans or genderqueer, I wouldn't necessarily know what to match there. So really looking at your forms, and I get emailed forms all the time to look at, so I'm happy to help. Just let me know what I can do. So programming, training, and support. Transgender Day of Remembrance is usually in the middle of November. It's already occurred for this year, but there's some really great resources that you can do there. If you do Tunnel of Oppression, you can include a gendered piece within Tunnel of Oppression. There are lots and lots of other resources available. Also, you can create a web-based campus resource guide for new and prospective transgender students. But I would also add here that there are also transgender faculty and staff. Oftentimes we provide these things for students and we forget about transitioning faculty and staff, that they need support too. So religion and spirituality was actually left out of the original article, and we're working on a summer project now. If you're interested in helping with this, please let us know. It's actually turned into a much bigger project than we thought it was going to be, and we're hoping to get something together within the next year. The fraternal movement was one of the first areas where I did research. And if you're interested, you can go to lambda10.org/transgender and pull down lots of information that I found. We did over 60 interviews with trans fraternity and sorority members who either transitioned prior to initiating, while they were an active member, or as an alumni member, and how that's worked out. How that impacts Title IX, things like this, that's all included there too. It's a really pretty amazing resource. And then lastly, athletics. Some of you may be aware of the trans man who is playing for the women's basketball team with George Washington. The NCAA actually just came out with a new policy that's actually one of the more inclusive policies. Basically what it means is that if someone is taking hormone replacement therapy after 1 year, it gives them a year to have impacted, or for their physicality or their endurance or strength to be impacted by those hormone therapies. And at the end of the year, they're able and eligible to play for the other gendered team. However, if they're not accessing hormone therapies, the assumption is that their endurance and strength would not be impacted. So they would be asked to stay on the original gendered team. This brings up lots of other questions around eligibility and redshirting and things like this, but those haven't been answered yet. So athletics is also an area that could use some work. So let me pause again and see how we're doing.
We had one question about the NCAA ruling, but I think you've or new policy, but I think you've answered that already. I have a comment, which I think, just to let you know, that Empower at USC, which is a social justice program at the University of South Carolina, is on the phone.
Woo!
So,
go Cox!
Yes, shout out to your alma mater, or one of them.
Yes, I got my master's there.
Yeah, and we have another question. I think it's a really good question. Is what is the best way to train peer educators to be inclusive of all trans individuals when the peers are not familiar with this information, especially if there is a trans student as a participant in the audience?
So that's a really good question, and it's really super awkward, right? Let's be honest with it. The ideal thing would be to do some trans education before there is a trans person in the audience so that they're not tokenized as the person who ends up having to do all the education. One thing that I often tell cisgendered people is that trans people know they're trans, and they're often looked at to do all the education. So any efforts that are taking place without tokenizing the one trans or gender variant student, staff, or faculty member is actually really appreciated because it takes the pressure off. Excuse me. If you don't have an out or visible trans person, I would say start doing education before you need it. What's interesting is that most of programming and student affairs, whether we want to admit it or not, I think is relatively reactive, in that we plan this year's programming and then next year we'll do whatever we should have done this year kind of stuff. And so bringing someone in to talk about gender, you don't need a trans resident or a trans student or a trans paraprofessional to be able to have these conversations, because we all have sex, gender, and a sexual identity. So being able to have those conversations before they have to be had, I think, is really important. Once you, again, because most of the times we're reactive, doing anything that doesn't burden the one trans student is also seen as really helpful, because then you're not tokenizing the one student. Because they know they're trans, you could ask them and have a conversation with them instead of assuming that you have to know everything. They know that you don't know everything, and what's interesting is they also don't know everything. So being able to work together and figuring out kind of what's happening, et cetera, can really stir up some really positive conversations on campus. I recommend doing an educational training, and then I have a lot of case studies and things like this that are also in that resource guide, and there's one actually on a slide. I don't know if we're going to have enough time to get to it, but being able to have these conversations before they're needed is actually being proactive by definition, and you can be able to figure out where the stumbling blocks are before a student does, or before you need to advocate for a particular student, because it's really frustrating because there's lots and lots of stumbling blocks. Whether you're talking on a college campus or in your community, et cetera. 2 days ago, we run the trans support group in town, and a trans woman who used to live, I live in a very small rural area, came back to town and was looking for a homeless shelter. And her identification card says F, and her friend's identification card says M. So they went to the men's homeless shelter to see if Brittany, but with a driver's license that says M, would be able to have a place to stay. So she did not feel welcomed or was able to be included in the men's shelter. It was very obvious that that was not going to work out due to homophobia and a fear of violence. So they both went over to the women and children's side of the homeless shelter, where they're not allowed to be because the driver's license didn't say F. So 2 women who have their spaces in the homeless shelters were turned away because people don't understand gender. It was 30 degrees that night. And not everybody has the ability to call Jessica to show up at the homeless shelter at 2 o'clock in the morning, where I was actually denied giving them access. I think that it's really important to understand that the trans students are already on our campuses. Trans faculty and staff are already on our campuses. You don't know about them necessarily because they don't feel safe. And maybe the few that you do know about, whether they feel safe or not, they feel like they don't have a choice, so they have to be visible. But there are more. One of the few things I liked about the Trans America movie is the quote that we walk among you. They're already here. I mean, Jeff, you mentioned South Carolina being on the call, so I got my master's degree back in the 1900s from the University of South Carolina, and that people were stunned that gay people happened in Columbia, South Carolina. But of course they did. That, there was definitely a scene and a community and a group on campus for faculty, staff, and for students. I was one of the advisors to the student group, et cetera. But that was back in the 1900s. So I would like to think naively that things have gotten better. But the truth of the matter is that very little has gotten better, not just at the University of South Carolina, but at other campuses, even who are making strides to include non-discrimination policies, to have gender identity and expression in organizations and visibility and programming. We still live in a sexist, heterosexist, very, very, very transphobic culture within the United States. So collectively, we need to be doing the work and claiming the responsibilities of our own privilege to do that education.
By the way, I don't like how you say back in the 1900s like we're really, really old now.
It was all the way back in the 1800s.
Yes.
Any other questions?
No other questions at this time.
How are we doing on time?
We got a good 5 minutes. We can go a couple minutes over if we need to.
Okay, great. So this is one of the case studies that's available in the resource guide. We probably won't have time to talk about it here, but I wanted to make it available just as a starting point of a conversation. So Lucy, a female student at your college who identifies as genderqueer and often dresses in a traditionally masculine manner, is assaulted but not seriously injured by 3 unidentified men in an anti-transgender hate crime the previous evening. The attack occurs on campus, and the perpetrators are thought to be other students. Seeing that you have a, quote, safe space placard on your office door, Z, which is a gender-neutral pronoun, Lucy prefers gender-neutral pronouns instead of gendered pronouns, comes to you first for support. What steps might you take to help here? How might Lucy's needs be different from a non-transgender student who has been assaulted? So I provide this as the first step because if Facebook can say it's complicated and we're okay with it, I think it's really important to understand that this case study is really complicated. A lot of people have safe space placards on their doors and don't know about trans issues. They don't know about bisexual issues, and a lot of safe zone programs or safe space programs really are addressing a very particular part of the lesbian and gay community. That's okay if you're completely transparent about that. And I don't think a lot of safe zone programs are transparent about the limitations of the training that people have or that the safe space placard holders are actually comfortable addressing. So they see this and they come to you. Maybe you are really good with this. So what are you going to do? How do you address, in this particular case, a physical assault without using gender for the particular assumed victim or alleged victim? When we talk about hospitals, healthcare services, judicial practices, residence hall programs, etc., it's really, really challenging. And what I encourage everyone to do is process this on your campus before it's needed, because the chances are is that you already have a Lucy who has been assaulted and didn't feel like they had any place to really go to. That, I think, is really, really unfortunate. And I think it's actually fixable. I think we just have to realize that it's okay that we don't know something, so now let's learn about it. I wanted to also make some other kind of pieces available before we run out of time, and then I'll open it up for more questions and answers. But because of the work that I do ongoingly around, as Jeff said, around the country, I had created a monthly newsletter. It's called Another Isolated Incident. You can sign up on my website, but I include a lot of trans and LGBT ally and advocate steps in the newsletter each month. It's free, and I don't spam you. It only comes out once a month. The joke is that it comes out around the 11th of every month. This National Coming Out Day is October 11th. Very few people pick up on that, but that's my sense of humor. I also have a monthly conference call called Go There. It's also free. It's 1 hour long. December's is coming up, December 8th at noon Pacific Standard Time, or I guess we're in daylight time. And it's a free call for people to call in, students, faculty, staff, I don't ID at the beginning of the conference call, to be able to talk about what's really happening on campus, whether it's related to race relations or transphobia or homophobia or working with the community. We're able to talk about what's happening on campus and share resources around the country, so I encourage you to take advantage of that. I also have a reflection journal. There's a lot of articles on my website. I'm going to be at a bunch of different conferences, so if you happen to be at any of these conferences, I'm happy to schedule one-on-one time with you to really talk about kind of what's happening on your campus or any particular questions. You can also contact me directly. And then I always include a coupon for any of the participants from any of my webinars. So if you're at all ever interested in bringing me to campus, when you contact Kirkland, if you use the JP plus KP coupon, they'll know that you were a participant on a webinar, and you'll get a free workshop for the price of a regular program. Anyway, any last questions or anything I can help you out with?
Just some people giving you some love on Twitter.
Oh, I love on Twitter. I can't get my Twitter account to work, so thank you very much for giving me love on Twitter.
Yes. And you are, is it I Am Social Justice on Twitter?
No, I think it's Pettitt Jess, P-E-T-T-I-T-T Jess, I think. I'm not very Twitter-y. I'm very Facebook-y, though. Feel free to Facebook me.
Jess, thank you so much for doing this. We're right at the 45-minute mark. So great to be on time. So we'll go ahead and end the conference now. But I just wanted to thank you again for participating, even though you're in the midst of a travel schedule right now.
No worries. There's nothing like doing a webinar in your pajamas.